I thought the phrase unknown and unknowable applied to the workouts, not the scoring system. Do we want the scoring at CrossFit events to be fair or to be fun? Should it be the most accurate representation of fitness on the field? Or should it be something easily understood by spectators that will keep them on the edge of their seat throughout the whole competition, including that final event? Is there any way it can be both? But let's be honest. When we're talking about scoring in sports, if you think about any sport for too long, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, of course, we have football here in the UK, or as some would call it, soccer. 1 goal equals 1 point. Nice and simple. It doesn't matter where you're standing on the pitch. But then you've got things like basketball. 2 points, 3 points. You can get your free throw and get 1 point. Then, of course, you've got rugby. Score a try, that's worth 5 points. It's pretty much the same thing as getting a touchdown in American football, which is worth 6 points. Should we even talk about tennis, love, 15, 30, 40, deuce? And then we've got sports where you have a panel of judges. Think of things like gymnastics or diving, where your average observer may not always understand the nuance and see why two people that did almost the identical thing got very different scores from that panel of judges. At least with races, it's usually pretty simple. You're going to have a finish line, and whether you're running, swimming, or using some kind of vehicle, the order in which you cross that line tends to be your position within the race. And then, of course, we have CrossFit, which is probably most similar to that concept of a race. You cross the finish line. Of course, you've just got a number of obstacles to complete on your way there. Or it may be an AMRAP, in which case it's going to be how much work you get accomplished. Or if it's going to be a 1 rep max or a total, then it's going to be the amount of weight a person was able to lift. But then, of course, the nature of a CrossFit competition means there are going to be multiple events. So we are going to need to put that information on some kind of table. So when we look at the scoring within CrossFit, very generally it falls into sort of 2 categories, either getting the lowest score or getting the highest score. Think of something like the Open, where your goal is to have the lowest score, and your score will usually equate to the position you finished. So if you finished first, that's 1 point, 10th would be 10 points, 100th 100 points. And over the course of a few events, you want to have that lowest number possible. Whereas in other competitions, we'll see the inverse. So you want to have the highest score possible. And when that happens, usually first place is awarded 100 points, and then the points decrease by a degree depending on how many athletes are in the field. And generally, there will be the same gap between first and second as there is between 6th and 5th. So far, so good. But there are a few things that can change that can dramatically impact the scoring system. And even if we don't have any of these changes, some people still feel with that scoring system, it will not be the best representation of the fitness on the field. And maybe there is a better way, but it's unlikely that CrossFit will adopt it, at least not considering some of the comments made by Adrian Bosman. And I suppose this is where we get into the conversation of, do we want the scoring systems within CrossFit events to be fair or to be fun? So an obvious question would be, in what way can the scoring system be unfair? And how can that actually affect the viewer experience? Well, to answer that question, let's just look at Wodapalooza and the elite team competition, for example. So they had 6 scored workouts before the field was cut to just 10 teams. But that didn't just mean that some teams finished their competition early, it also meant they needed to readjust the point spread for your position when you finished an event now divided across 10 teams. And this made a huge difference, because now the difference in points between a first place and a second place, or a first place and a third or fourth place, meant that these events were weighted far more heavily than the previous 6. But what that did mean going into that final event is that no one was safe. It didn't matter how well they had done in the previous 6 events. No one was going to be able to phone in a victory in these final events. Now the question is, was that fair? Was it fair to so heavily weight the final 2 workouts? Now many felt that this wasn't fair. This didn't reward the athletes that had been consistently good through the previous events. But was it fun? Was it engaging? Now if the audience in the stadium or people watching at home are made aware of the change to the score system, of the leaderboards, of how many points there are between different teams, then yes, this would have been fun. This would have been engaging. It was all on the line in those final workouts. And we know this isn't just Wodapalooza. With other competitions as well, we see cuts. When this happens, they have to adjust the point spread and readjust just how many points you get finishing in different positions. Sometimes after cuts, they even reset the leaderboard. And obviously some would think that that's not fair. You're not being rewarded for all the hard work you did before the cuts. Although maybe the reward is making it through the cut. But really the argument tends to be that this is not a fair test of fitness, and that's what people want to see. So that's the next question, isn't it? Is that what people want to see? A fair test of fitness? Because you may have heard people talk about the need to change the scoring system within CrossFit, even at the top level like the CrossFit Games. Now probably the one we've heard the most talk about would be the Z scoring system. And this is a way of scoring that really rewards the performance of the athletes. And there is an argument to be made that this can actually be more entertaining for spectators because it forces athletes to push hard. Just because they're in first, they want to try and enlarge that margin of victory over the person in second. Or even if they're in last place, there is still motivation for them to try and get as close to the people in front of them as they can. But notice these comments from Adrian Bosman and Rory McKernan.
There's invariables. It's not just about the presentation of facts or data, right?
Sure.
Because you mentioned earlier about being a fan. I've heard recently people kind of rehashing the question of how these events should be scored, namely CrossFit, and I think they went over the Rogue Invitational. And it's like, all that's fine and good, but if you go to something like a decathlon scoring where I need an abacus and a calculator and like a working knowledge of algebra 5, it's just not fun to watch anymore.
Yeah.
You know, it has to be able to be like, oh, this happened, that means this person goes here and this person goes here, and someone who's watching for the first time can get invested in the sport and actually enjoy watching it.
Yeah, for sure. And there's like a logical end state that you can take things to that may satisfy those that have that kind of bent, I guess. But to your point, I think they can really kill it for the rest of us. Like, for example, you know, if we really wanted to get hardcore about things, you would take limb length measurements, you would find the distance traveled by all of the stuff, you would calculate the output, and then based on that, you could definitively say, well, despite the fact that Boz and Rory did 21:59 and Boz went a little bit faster, Rory actually wins because he traveled more distance every rep, he's a heavier athlete, blah, blah, blah. But on paper, when I see the race and you see Boz win, and then after the fact, you come over the top and you say, well, actually, Rory won, you know, like
Right.
It's just, nobody's compelled by that. And so that's an extreme example of, you know, if you need to be a purist in that regard, you also have to look at what you're going to discard in that process, and just, you know, make the call. So.
Yep, without a doubt, because we are as sports go, we are a pretty nerdy and statistically oriented fan group, but still there's barriers to entry, and there's minimum viable amounts that you can actually tolerate without pushing people away or getting them to be disengaged.
Yeah, and it is interesting too, because you hear about it. You know, people want the sport to grow. I mean, I want the sport to grow. It's I think that's a priority for everybody. And if we are truly interested in having that happen outside of the people that are directly doing it day to day, it has to have some level of accessibility. Now, you can't water it down. You can't make it, you know, become something that it's not. That's a mistake too. But you have to recognize that, you know, it's not going to be as easy for somebody to step into as like a game of baseball or something that they're used to.
Yeah.
So it seems from that discussion, the problem is how easy is it to understand these scoring systems. So the way the Z scoring would work, if we did a workout and I won and you came second and I beat you by 1 second, but then we redid that workout and you won and I came second, but you beat me by 10 seconds, in the overall standings, you would be rewarded for having a more dominant finish. And obviously that applies across the whole field and across multiple events. So on that simple example of 2 athletes, first and second, it's quite easy, but will it be understood across an entire field of athletes over a whole weekend or more of competition? Or would we get into a position where just your casual observer doesn't quite understand why athlete A is beating athlete B, even though on paper, just looking at the positions they finished, they would assume athlete B would be in the lead. And it's because it's based on the relative performance. So maybe that one athlete had some really dominant finishes compared to the other athlete who maybe got a few wins, but they were very close. Now, obviously, Boz then takes it to this extreme example with things like limb length, but we can think about things like weight categories that we see cropping up in other sports, something that we don't have generally within CrossFit. So athletes will always have advantages and disadvantages when they compete. So really the question comes down to, do we want the most fair test possible to really determine the fitness at play, or do we just want something fun and entertaining to watch? Now, obviously, the majority of athletes we'd assume would opt for the fairest test possible, especially when we think that prize money is on the line. But at the same time, if we want to increase that prize pot, we need to try and bring in as many new viewers as possible. So making it fun and entertaining really needs to be what they're doing in order to achieve that goal. Also, we really need competitions and events to define their purpose before starting. Is it a test of fitness to determine the fittest on earth? Or is it just an exhibition for people to demonstrate and show off their fitness that may include some curveballs in the scoring system? But if athletes know that going in, then they shouldn't have a problem with it. But in either case, what will always be needed is clear communication. Yes, for the athletes that are signing up, but also for the spectators, whether they are in the stands watching or at home watching a live stream. If it's a slightly more complex leaderboard, then it needs to be explained along the way so it's easy for people to follow. Or if you're making big changes to the scoring system partway through a competition that's going to really shake up the leaderboard, people need to know that. They need to know where the athletes stand going into that event, how the points are being distributed, and why it's still all to play for going into that event. Because ultimately, if people are uninformed, they're going to become uninterested. And if they're uninterested, they're going to switch it off. And at that point, it really doesn't matter what scoring system we have if no one is watching.